What is the most venomous snake in your home state? As it turns out, of the 50 US states, 48 of them are home to venomous snakes. And sure, some of them are way more toxic than others. But at the same time, it's really hard to determine which is the most venomous in each state. There are tons of overlapping ranges, conflicting data, and even flat out lies about these animals being in certain places. So today, we're going to be making a map of where each of these snake territories ends and another begins. This is the venom map. Now before we begin, I'd like to point out that some of the things in this video are going to be my opinion. After all, how exactly are we going to be judging how venomous each snake is? There's lots of different ways to go about this, but for this video in particular, we'll be looking at a balance between venom yield, venom toxicity, as well as the snake's ability to actually strike. I'm going to touch more on this later with a few of our snakes, but the point of this video is for you to be more aware of the species found in each state, and to gain some appreciation of the diversity of these animals in the US. But now that we know what we're generally dealing with, we can start to map out their territories. I've broken this video up into 10 distinct areas, and each of these areas is ruled by a different species. And the first one on our list is the Southeastern coastal plain. It's characterized by a lot of sandy soils, usually entozols and eutozols, and can have a lot of interesting wetland habitats, but is known more so for savannas and a lot of really nice sandhills. It's also incredibly hot and humid down here. Undeniably, this region is ruled by the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, the largest rattlesnake species on Earth. These impressive snakes have that classic diamondback patterning, and they have a greenish coloration that just looks awesome. They can sometimes be a little bit yellowish or brown, but this is typically what you're going to be looking for. Typically, the eastern diamondback spends a lot of its time underground, whether in stump holes or gopher tortoise burrows. And when they come out, they like to sit in ambush hunting for various small mammals. And they can be found through a lot of different habitats in the coastal plain. But their favorite habitats tend to be longleaf pine savannas. Also, I've worked with these snakes a lot, and let me tell you, they are an intimidating animal. I would never consider them to be aggressive by any means, but they are just super athletic and intimidating snakes. So if you live in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, or either of the Carolinas, both South and North Carolina, this is by far your most venomous snake. Now you might be thinking to yourself, but what about the eastern coral snake? Doesn't this share a very similar range to the diamondback? And you'd be right. And eastern coral snakes are drop for drop the most toxic snake in the US. These guys are elapids, unlike most of the other snakes we're going to cover today, which are vipers. They're certainly the most toxic, but they also have a very low venom yield, and they're unlikely to strike. And as I mentioned earlier, today we're not just looking at toxicity of snakes, but also the venom quantity and their ability to strike. Coral snakes are not only rare, but they're quite mild and really small, which means they don't have a lot of venom. So for the purposes of this video, coral snakes aren't going to be winning any states. But if you do want to learn about these snakes, we have a video covering every single coral snake species in the US, from the East Coast all the way out to the Sonoran Desert. Now, regarding the eastern diamondback, if you live in North Carolina, you're likely never going to see one outside of a very tiny corner of the state. I believe there's just a couple of populations left, if not just one. It is still the most venomous snake in the state, but most likely our next snake is the one that you'd be more likely to encounter. And it rules a much wider portion of the state. As you get away from the coastal plains, you get into a wider habitat of the eastern forests. The eastern forests of the US are historically a vast network of hardwoods and mixed forests stretching from the coastal plain all the way up to the Great Lakes. I'm grouping a lot of habitats together here because you've got things like Piedmonts, temperate rainforest, historically what would have been a bunch of chestnut forests, rest in peace. And these areas usually have a lot more habitat structure and more distinct seasons. Which brings me to our most wide-ranging snake, which happens to be the most venomous for over 20 states, the timber rattlesnake. These are going to be taking up the largest part of our venom map. These rattlesnakes typically have chevrons instead of diamonds down their back, with a lot of color variation depending on where you are. Some of these snakes can be jet black, while others can be a more yellowish green tinge, but closer to the coast you tend to get more of those browns and grays. These guys vary a lot, which is why there used to be a subspecies of the timber rattlesnake that we'll get into later. From my experience, they're generally one of the more chill rattlesnake species, but they are incredibly camouflage. And they're really easy for people to step on. Of the eastern states, they're the most venomous snake in Connecticut, Delaware, Indiana, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Vermont, Virginia, and West Virginia. Basically the entirety of the eastern US. But there is one northeastern state that the timber rattlesnake does not rule in, and it's because of a very unique ecoregion around the Great Lakes. This region is most known for its giant freshwater lakes and its historic prairies, most of which were carved out by glaciers, meaning historically a lot of wildlife that could have lived here was pushed further south. The region's glacial history continues to influence everything around it, from its soils and hydrology to the species living there. And while the timber rattlesnake used to just barely range into Michigan, it has since been extirpated from the state, which means by default, the eastern Massasauga is the most venomous snake in Michigan. The only Cerceris or pygmy rattlesnake on our list today, the eastern Massasauga spends most of its life hidden around wet prairies and more grassy environments than the timbers do. Like most rattlesnakes, it relies on camouflage to avoid predators, and it feeds on a lot of small mammals and amphibians in these grasslands. I often do hear a lot of fear-mongering in the state of Michigan about these snakes, and while its venom is certainly medically significant, their ranges are really pocketed, so unless you live in an area where they're incredibly dense or you go to a place where there's lots of Massasaugas, you're really not going to see these animals pop up sporadically. Bites are rare, and fatalities are even rarer. If anything, I think it's really cool that we have a rattlesnake that can live in this region. So because of some of their unique ecology, the eastern Massasauga is the uncontested most venomous snake of Michigan. Also, if you end up learning something new about venomous snakes from this video, or if you disagree with any of my rankings and you want to let me know in the comments later, make sure to subscribe. I'm working to make as many educational videos about snakes over the summer, and getting footage of these animals in habitat takes a lot of time and effort, so it really helps the channel out. But now, back to our regularly scheduled timber rattlesnake show. What, you thought we were done with these guys? No. Not only do they rule the eastern forests, but they also rule the upper and lower Mississippi River Valley. This vast region is dominated by the river floodplains and lowland hardwood forests of the Mississippi River. And this landscape forms one of America's most important ecological corridors, and it's another massive stronghold for the timber rattlesnake. Known colloquially throughout this region as the canebrake rattlesnake. In the upper river valley, this is going to include states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, and for the lower river valley, we have Arkansas and Louisiana, my home state. I talked about this a lot in our last video, but while the eastern diamondback did historically range to Louisiana, they have since been completely extirpated. Allegedly, of course. I think there's still a few places where these animals can be, but functionally, they are extinct. And while there are Texas coral snakes, cottonmouths, and even western diamondbacks in parts of Arkansas, the timber rattlesnake is still the winner of these states. But guess what? It gets even worse because the timber rattlesnake is still the most venomous snake in parts of the southern plains. The southern plains are an expansive grassland stretching across Texas, Oklahoma, and parts of Kansas and New Mexico, and is a part of the greater Great Plains region. It's dominated by deep mollisol soils and some sandy patches. Historically, it was shaped by a lot of bison grazing and wildfires, but nowadays it is heavy on agriculture. The southern plains form a transition zone between the more humid east and the rest of the Great Plains to the north and west. Now, some would argue that the western diamondback rattlesnake is the most venomous in a couple of these states, but I'm here to tell you it is in fact still the timber rattlesnake. But you can virtually split these three states in half, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, into their eastern and western portions, as the habitats transition wildly here and they're so big. But aside from Texas, which we'll get into later, it's undeniable that the timber rattlesnake is still the most venomous for Oklahoma and Kansas. Now, stepping into the Wild West, we have the Great Plains region, an endless sea of farms and grasslands stretching as far south as Texas, all the way up to the Canadian border. And I will say, this is the part of the US that I have the least personal experience in. But what I do know is that there's a lot of good structure here with all the grasslands and mammal burrows. And while it may appear empty at first, the Great Plains support a lot of subterranean life, which is going to include a pile of different snakes. And it's only right that the most venomous snake in the prairie is the prairie rattlesnake. This adaptable little rattlesnake species thrives in a variety of habitats, from short grass prairies to rocky canyons, and even some urban environments. There are smaller rattlesnake species, usually somewhere around 3 feet in length at max. While they're not as famous as some of their larger relatives, it is responsible for a significant amount of venomous snake bites in the central US. For their size, they are a pretty toxic rattlesnake. I was also surprised to see that western diamondback rattlesnakes and prairie rattlesnakes don't have nearly as much overlap as I'd initially thought. Prairie rattlesnakes really go up north, and they really only cross up a little bit in the South Plains and some parts of Texas. Their small size and usage of mammal burrows means that they can survive some pretty harsh winters. And these snakes historically had some of the largest rattlesnake dens that we ever saw. So for the states of Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, the prairie rattlesnake is our most venomous. Now, people in Colorado might be thinking that the prairie rattlesnake is their most venomous as well, but it actually isn't. But we'll get to that in a little bit. As the prairies start to lose out, we get into the Great Basin. And in this region, the western rattlesnakes win out, particularly the midget-faded and Great Basin rattlesnakes. These are both a subspecies of western rattlesnake, and differentiating these two snakes is difficult at a first glance. Many people would just consider them to be the same species. If you want to learn more about that, we did a video on every single rattlesnake species in the world. And if you're curious about that, here's a timestamp in that video to go check out because it is certainly complex. But in Idaho, the most venomous snake is the Great Basin rattlesnake. And in Colorado, it's the midget-faded. Now, some people in Colorado would still argue that it's the prairie rattlesnake, but I would argue that it's my video and it's my opinion. And if I had to be bitten by one or the other, personally, I'd pick the prairie rattlesnake before any big western. But moving right along, we get into the Pacific Northwest. From temperate rainforests to high elevation alpine habitats, and of course, it's ruled by the northern Pacific rattlesnake. On average, they're smaller, but they can get around 5 feet in length sometimes. And once again, as they are a western rattlesnake variant, they can be very difficult for people to identify. Really though, for these two states, it's not going to be a contest as they're the only venomous species in this region. So for both Oregon and Washington, the northern Pacific rattlesnake is your most venomous. Pretty cool snakes, pretty cool region, 10 out of 10. I hope to visit soon. And now for the moment that many of you have been waiting for, let's get into the Southwest deserts. Arguably the most iconic snake country in North America. This vast region encompasses landscapes like the Sonoran Desert, the Mojave Desert, and the Chihuahuan Desert, each with its own unique climate, geography, and animals. Defined by scorching hot summers and oftentimes very sparse rainfall, these deserts have a lot of aridizole soils and a lot of different unique rocky terrains that support a surprising amount of life. Now, there are a ton of different venomous snake species out here. You've got Trans-Pecos copperheads, obviously western diamondback rattlesnakes, sidewinders. Most of the venomous snakes are going to be rattlesnakes, but it's still no contest the Mojave rattlesnake. This infamous rattlesnake species inhabits various different desert, grassland, and scrubland habitats throughout the American Southwest. And they do look pretty similar to our other rattlesnake species like western diamondbacks and prairies. And they're not notably big or common either. What sets them apart is their venom, which is comprised of a lot of neurotoxic components. Now, this isn't super unique amongst rattlesnakes. In fact, the southern Pacific rattlesnake and even the timber rattlesnake and prairie rattlesnake have neurotoxic components. The Mojaves just so happen to be the poster child of this and the most potent. The Mojave is not only the most venomous snake in Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Utah, but is also currently known as the most venomous rattlesnake in the world. Now, we'll point out these snakes barely range into Utah. You're not likely to encounter one there, kind of like diamondbacks in North Carolina. And the other option would be to give the state to the midget-faded rattlesnake, but I'm not doing that. They also sort of split Texas in half. As I mentioned before, you can kind of cut these southern plains states in half between the timber rattlesnake and another species. And for Texas, the western half is certainly ruled by the Mojaves, and in the eastern half, it's going to be the timbers. But if you were to compare them side by side, the Mojave rattlesnake is a much more venomous species. And before we move on to our special states, I want to talk about a quick argument for the southern Pacific rattlesnake in South California. These guys are highly toxic. In fact, this year alone, we've had 2 deaths attributed to the southern Pacific rattlesnake and 1 to the northern Pacific in the state. They're highly toxic, they have neurotoxic components just like Mojaves do, but southern Pacific rattlesnakes are certainly one to keep an eye out for in South California. But they still aren't the most venomous species. That goes to the Mojaves. And finally, we are down to our last 3 states. And first up, we have Hawaii. But Zach, there's no native snakes to Hawaii. Nope, you're wrong. Yellow-bellied sea snake. Yep, a sea snake made the list. That's why I said earlier that most of the animals on this list would be vipers. So we do have one elapid winning a state here. The Pacific Ocean is the largest and deepest ocean on Earth, covering 60 million square miles and connecting ecosystems and populations of island species, coral reefs, and a lot of different open ocean gyres. And for the yellow-bellied sea snake, this is all just one big, expansive habitat as far as we currently know. This species crosses expansive portions of the Pacific Ocean, feeding primarily on small fish at the water's surface. And these snakes have a highly potent neurotoxic venom for catching fish. And while bites to humans are exceptionally rare due to their offshore lifestyle and their non-aggressive nature, occasionally they do wash ashore, which makes them Hawaii's only venomous snake. I didn't say that it had to be a land snake, and I'm certainly counting sea snakes for Hawaii, as rare as the encounters may be. While I don't believe Hawaii has any resident populations of these snakes, like places in Costa Rica, it's still well within their range in the Pacific, so I am gonna count it. And I guarantee you most of y'all thought Hawaii was not going to be on this list. But finally, we do have our last two states. And before you pull out the flight list and start prepping to move, these places are harsh. They are desolate landscapes where life, both reptiles and people, struggle to survive. First up, we have Alaska. Sprawling tundras, boreal forests, and glaciers, some of the harshest winters that you can experience. While a small handful of amphibians manage to survive up here, there are no reptiles within the state. And lastly on our list, we have Rhode Island with an overall state tax burden of 9%. Not even a snake could survive such theft. In all seriousness, timber rattlesnakes and allegedly copperheads used to inhabit the state of Rhode Island, but they have since been extirpated, so while they do have snakes in the state, there are currently no documented cases of either of these species in the last few decades. And that is the entirety of the US. Every single state mapped out by their most venomous snakes. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this video where we explain why some venomous snakes, particularly the eastern diamondback, are vanishing. Thank y'all for watching this video, and we will see you guys next time.